punch landed before John even saw it coming. It was a dull, crushing blow to his stomach, the kind that steals air before it steals pain. His breath collapsed inside him, sharp and sudden, and his knees gave way as if they'd been waiting for permission. The classroom erupted. Chairs scraped backward. Laughter burst out in waves, and someone slapped a desk like this was a show they'd paid to see. Wait, subscribe to support this channel, it means a lot to us. As we continue, John hit the floor hard. His palms scraped against the cold tiles, his backpack sliding off his shoulders like it wanted no part of him anymore. He curled in on himself, arms wrapped around his stomach, eyes squeezed shut. The pain wasn't just physical. It was familiar. Too familiar. Rick stood over him. Rick always stood over him. Rick was tall for his age, broad-shouldered, with that permanent grin that looked like it had been carved into his face. His uniform was untucked, his tie loose, his confidence overflowing. He looked down at John the way people looked at trash they hadn't bothered to step around. "What's wrong?" Rick said loudly. "You forget how to stand again?" The laughter grew louder. Someone whistled. Someone else said, "Get up, John," in a mocking sing-song voice. John didn't answer. He never did. He kept his eyes on the floor, staring at a crack in the tile that looked like a lightning bolt frozen in time. If he focused hard enough, if he counted his breaths, maybe the moment would pass faster. Maybe they'd get bored. They always did eventually. Rick nudged him with the tip of his shoe. Not hard, just enough to remind him who controlled the space. "You hear me?" Rick said. "Or did that knock what little brain you got out of place?" A teacher's voice echoed faintly from down the hall, but it was far enough away to mean nothing. Rick knew the timing. He always did. John finally looked up, not at Rick's face but at his shoes. Clean, new, probably bought without a second thought. Rick leaned down, hands on his knees, bringing his face closer. "You know," he said, lowering his voice just enough to sound serious, "you'll never be anything but a punching bag." Something about the way he said it made the laughter slow, like even the class felt the weight of it. John's ears rang. The words sank deep, deeper than the punch ever could. He felt them settle somewhere behind his ribs, heavy and cold. He didn't cry. He didn't shout. He didn't swing back. The bell rang moments later, shrill and sudden. Desks moved. Shoes shuffled. The crowd dissolved as quickly as it had formed. Rick straightened up, adjusted his tie, and walked away like nothing had happened. "Same time tomorrow," Rick tossed over his shoulder. John stayed on the floor a few seconds longer than necessary. When he finally pushed himself up, his hands were shaking, but his face was blank. A girl he barely knew hesitated like she might help him, then thought better of it and followed everyone else. John picked up his backpack and walked out of the classroom alone. That night, his room was quiet except for the hum of the old television. His parents were asleep. Homework sat unfinished on his desk, pages filled with half-written answers. John lay on his bed, staring at the ceiling, replaying the moment again and again. The punch, the laughter, the words. "You'll never be anything but a punching bag." He rolled onto his side, jaw tight, fingers digging into the blanket. His stomach still ached, but the deeper pain was somewhere else. He felt small, not weak small, like the world had decided his size and sealed it shut. He reached for the remote just to have something to do with his hands. The TV flickered as he flipped through channels without really seeing them. News, commercials, static, then suddenly movement. A fight scene. John's thumb stopped. On the screen, a skinny kid about his age was getting knocked around in a dusty gym. Bruises, blood, laughter from bigger guys. It looked uncomfortably familiar. John almost changed the channel, but he didn't. The scene shifted. The kid stood up again. And again. He trained alone over and over, failing, falling, learning. The music swelled. The punches became sharper. The movements cleaner. The boy's eyes changed. John sat up. He forgot about the pain in his stomach. Forgot about the time. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, eyes locked on the screen. Every kick, every block, every breath the character took felt important. When the movie ended, John realized his hands were clenched. His heart was racing. He didn't move when the credits rolled. Something inside him stirred. Not anger, not hatred, curiosity. He rewound the movie. This time he paid attention. Not to the story but to the movement. How the fighter stood. How he shifted his weight. How he breathed before throwing a punch. John mimicked the stance without thinking, feet pressing into the carpet. He felt ridiculous, but he also felt awake. Over the next few nights it became a ritual. Homework, dinner, silence, movie. He watched the same scenes again and again, sometimes pausing, sometimes rewinding, sometimes standing in front of the TV, copying what he saw. His arms moved awkwardly at first. He stumbled. He lost balance. But he didn't stop. By the end of the week, the bruises on his stomach faded. The words didn't. At school, Rick kept doing what Rick always did. A shove in the hallway. A shoulder check. A whispered insult. John took it. But something was different. When Rick pushed him, John noticed his stance. Too wide. Unbalanced. When Rick swung his arm, John saw the opening. He didn't act on it. Not yet. At night he practiced more. He punched the air until his arms burned. He learned where to place his feet. He learned how to breathe through discomfort. The room filled with quiet effort. One night, he caught his reflection in the dark TV screen. He paused. He didn't look strong. But he didn't look empty anymore either. John sat back on his bed, breathing hard, sweat cooling on his skin. The movie menu glowed on the screen, waiting. He realized something then. Rick had taken his pride. The class had taken his voice. But this was his. No one was laughing. No one was watching. And for the first time, the silence didn't feel like defeat. Felt like the beginning. The next morning didn't announce itself as special. The sun rose the same way it always did. Pale light slipping through John's curtains. Dust floating in the air like it had nowhere better to be. His alarm buzzed. He turned it off. Sat up. For a moment, everything felt normal. Then his body remembered. His shoulders were sore. His arms felt tight, like invisible strings had been pulled too far and left there overnight. John flexed his fingers slowly. There was a dull ache in his knuckles. Not pain, not injury, just proof. He stared at his hands. Something about them felt different. Not stronger. Not tougher. Just used. He got dressed, ate breakfast in silence, and walked to school with his backpack slung over one shoulder. His parents spoke about bills, about errands, about things that floated past him without landing. John nodded when he needed to. Inside, his mind replayed scenes from the movie. Footwork, balance, breath. At school, nothing had changed. And everything had. Rick shoved him near the lockers, hard enough to make his books slide halfway out of his bag. "Watch where you're going," Rick said, smirking. John bent down to pick up his books. But this time he noticed how Rick stood when he pushed, how his weight leaned forward, how his feet planted too heavy. John's heart didn't race like it usually did. Instead, his mind felt sharp. Rick waited for the usual reaction. The apology, the silence, the flinch. John gave him none of it. He stood up calmly, looked Rick straight in the chest, not his eyes, and walked away. "See," Rick laughed to his friends. "Told you." But John heard something else beneath the laughter. Confusion. That afternoon, John didn't go straight to his room. He went to the basement. It wasn't much of a space. Concrete floor. Low ceiling. Old boxes stacked against the wall. A smell of dust and forgotten things. The kind of place no one ever paid attention to. Perfect. He dragged an old tire from the corner, propping it upright. Filled his backpack with books until it felt heavy enough to pull him backward. He picked up a broomstick and tested its weight in his hands. Too light, but it would do. John set his laptop on a crate, opened the movie, and paused at the first training scene. "Okay," he whispered to himself. He pressed play. The first punch he threw into the air looked nothing like the one on screen. His elbow flared out. His balance wobbled. He nearly tripped over his own feet. John frowned, rewound the scene, and watched again. Slower this time. He tried again. Better. Not good, but better. He punched the tire. The impact sent a jolt up his arm. He hissed, shaking his hand, then went again, and again. Minutes turned into an hour, then two. By the time he stopped, his arms were trembling. Sweat soaked through his shirt. His breathing was heavy and uneven. He collapsed onto the floor, staring up at the cracked ceiling. He smiled, just a little. The next day he came back, and the day after that. John built a routine without even realizing it. School, silence, basement, movie, training, repeat. He studied the fights the way other kids studied textbooks. He paused frames. He rewound moments. He copied stances until they felt natural. He learned how to shift his weight instead of muscling through a punch. Learned how to keep his guard up even when he was tired. Learned that strength wasn't loud, it was controlled. His hands blistered, then hardened. His breathing slowed. His movements sharpened. At school, the bullying continued, but it started to change shape. Rick noticed. "Why you looking at me like that?" Rick snapped one day when John didn't look away fast enough. John shrugged. "Just looking. That was new." Rick didn't like new. Rumors began to move through the halls faster than homework answers. "John's gone weird. He doesn't talk anymore. He's probably planning something." John heard them all. He let them pass through him like wind through an open window. In the basement, his obsession deepened. He added push-ups between scenes, sit-ups during rewinds. He practiced kicks while holding onto a chair for balance. When his legs shook, he kept going. When his lungs burned, he slowed his breathing like the fighter on screen had done. One night, he missed a step and slammed into the concrete floor. Pain exploded through his shoulder. He lay there gasping, eyes watering. "Get up," he muttered to himself. He did. The mirror came later. A small, dusty mirror leaned against the wall. John caught his reflection while practicing a stance. His posture was straighter. His shoulders sat differently. His eyes, calm, focused, barely looked like his own anymore. He wasn't big. He wasn't scary. But he was present. Rick tried harder, shoved him harder, insulted him louder. John didn't react. That bothered Rick more than anything else. One afternoon, Rick leaned in close and whispered, "You think you're tough now?" John met his eyes. Calm. Still. "No," he said. Rick laughed. "Good." But John finished the thought in his head. Not yet. Weeks passed. The basement grew familiar. The tire wore scuff marks. The broomstick splintered and was replaced. John moved with purpose now. Every punch had intention. Every movement had balance. He wasn't dreaming about fighting anymore. He was preparing. Not for revenge. For control. One night, after training, John sat on the floor, back against the wall, breathing steadily. The movie menu glowed again on the laptop screen. He didn't press play right away. He thought about the boy on the screen, the one who'd been laughed at, knocked down, underestimated. He thought about himself. They weren't the same, but they weren't so different either. John stood up, wiped the sweat from his face, and turned off the laptop. The basement went dark, but something inside him stayed lit. Silence can be loud when people expect you to break it. John learned that quickly. By the time the third week passed, his quiet wasn't ignored anymore. It was watched. He walked through the hallways with the same steady pace every day, eyes forward, shoulders relaxed. He didn't rush. He didn't shrink. He existed, and that alone unsettled people who were used to him disappearing. Rick noticed first. He always did. It started with small things. Rick blocking John's path and waiting for him to look down. John didn't. Rick bumping his shoulder harder than usual, expecting a reaction. John barely shifted. Rick mocking him in front of others, louder, sharper, crueler. "Hey, movie star!" Rick called one afternoon as John opened his locker. "What's the matter? You mute now?" A few kids laughed. Others watched quietly, sensing something unfamiliar in the air. John closed his locker slowly and turned. He didn't rush the movement. He didn't tense up. He simply faced Rick. His expression was calm. Not bored, not angry. Calm in a way that made people uncomfortable. Rick frowned. "What?" "Nothing," John said. His voice was even. "That was all." Rick scoffed, but the laugh that followed sounded forced. "Yeah, thought so." He walked away, but not before glancing back once, as if checking whether John would crumble the moment he turned his back. John didn't. Word spread. "John's acting strange. He doesn't react anymore." Maybe he finally snapped. John heard it all. He said nothing. Silence had become his shield. At home, the basement training intensified. John wasn't just copying movements anymore, he was understanding them. He learned why a punch landed harder when the hips turned with it. Why balance mattered more than speed. Why breathing controlled fear as much as it controlled endurance. Some nights, his muscles screamed at him to stop. He listened, then kept going anyway, adjusting, refining, improving. Pain became information. Failure became instruction. At school, Rick's patience thinned. One day, Rick knocked John's books out of his hands in the hallway. Papers scattered across the floor. The hall went quiet. Everyone waited for the usual response. John crouched, calmly gathering his papers. Rick kicked one away. John picked it up. "You gonna do something?" Rick demanded. John stood. He looked at Rick. Not through him, not past him. At him. Direct. Focused. "I am," John said. Rick laughed. Too loudly. "Yeah? When?" John didn't answer. He walked away. That night, John stood alone in the basement. Fists raised. Breathing steady. He wasn't angry. He wasn't scared. He was ready but patient. The movie played in the background, but he barely glanced at it now. His body remembered what to do. Control. Timing. Stillness before motion. The next afternoon, the moment came without drama. The gym was mostly empty. Practice had ended early. The sun dipped low, casting long shadows behind the building. John cut through the narrow path behind the gym like he always did. Footsteps followed. "Hey!" Rick called. John stopped. Slowly, he turned. Rick stood there alone. No friends. No audience. His hands were in his pockets. Posture loose but alert. This wasn't a show. This was something else. "You've been acting real funny lately," Rick said. John said nothing. Rick stepped closer. "You think you're better than me now?" "No," John replied. Rick's jaw tightened. "Then why you looking at me like that?" John met his eyes. "Like what?" Rick hesitated. The pause was brief, but it existed. "Like you're not scared." John tilted his head slightly. "I'm not." The air shifted. Rick laughed once, sharp and humorless. "You're still the same, man. Still weak." "Maybe," John said. Rick shoved him. Hard. John took a step back, absorbing the force the way he'd practiced. His feet found balance without thinking. He straightened. Calm. Rick froze. Just for a second. "Still not gonna fight back?" Rick sneered. John exhaled slowly. "Try me." The words weren't loud. They weren't dramatic. They landed heavier than any insult Rick had ever thrown. Rick swung. It was wide. Sloppy. Exactly like the punches John had watched hundreds of times on a laptop screen. Time seemed to slow, not magically, not unrealistically, but because John's mind was prepared. He ducked. One step. One twist. One controlled counter. Rick stumbled forward, caught off balance. Shock flashed across his face before he could hide it. He turned, swinging again, anger replacing confidence. John blocked, redirected, moved. The fight didn't look like chaos. It looked like control meeting panic. Rick lunged. John sidestepped. Rick swung. John countered not with rage but precision. A final movement. Rick hit the ground hard. Silence filled the space behind the gym. Rick lay there, breathing fast, eyes wide. Not injured badly, but defeated in a way he didn't understand yet. John stood over him. His fists were still raised, but his breathing was calm, steady. He lowered his hands. Rick stared up at him, fear mixing with disbelief. You've been planning this, Rick muttered. John shook his head. No, he reached out his hand. Rick hesitated. The moment stretched. Then he took it. John pulled him to his feet easily, not because he was stronger, but because Rick was unsteady. Now you know what it feels like, John said quietly. Don't make anyone else feel it. Rick didn't reply. He just nodded once, jaw clenched, eyes lowered. John turned and walked away. The rumors exploded the next day, but they sounded different now. He stood up to Rick. He didn't even lose control. He helped him up. No one laughed when John passed anymore. They watched, some with respect, some with curiosity, some with relief. John returned to the basement that night. He trained lightly, focused, calm. The movie played again, but this time he smiled, not because the hero won, but because he understood something deeper now. Strength wasn't about proving anything. It was about choosing when not to. The silence after the fight didn't feel empty, felt full. John noticed it the moment he stepped into school the next morning. Conversations didn't stop, but they softened. Eyes followed him, not with mockery, not with challenge, but with curiosity. He wasn't invisible anymore, and strangely, that didn't make him uncomfortable. Rick was there too, different, quieter. His shoulders weren't thrown back like they used to be. He laughed less. When his friends talked loud, he listened instead of leading. The power had shifted, and everyone could sense it even if no one said it out loud. John took his seat and opened his notebook. His hands were steady. No shaking. No rush of adrenaline. The fight behind the gym already felt distant, like a lesson learned and filed away. A voice whispered behind him. Dude, what did you do to Rick? John didn't turn around. Nothing, he said. That answer spread faster than the truth. Teachers noticed the change too. One of them paused mid-lecture, glancing at John as if seeing him clearly for the first time. Another nodded at him in the hallway, surprised when John nodded back without shrinking. But the real change didn't happen at school. It happened inside John. That evening in the basement, he didn't train the way he usually did. He stood still for a long time, breathing slowly, replaying the fight in his head. Not with excitement, with analysis. He remembered the moment Rick swung, the moment Rick hesitated, the moment control decided everything. John realized something important then. If he hadn't trained his mind as much as his body, the fight would have ended differently. Fear used to live in his muscles. Now it didn't know where to sit. He practiced lightly, slow movements, precision over power. He focused on balance, on restraint, on stopping himself mid-motion. It was harder than throwing punches. The next day it was tested. A smaller kid, Marcus, got shoved near the lockers. Not by Rick, by someone else. Laughter followed. The old pattern replaying itself with a different target. John watched from a distance. His chest tightened. This time it wasn't happening to him. He stepped forward. Not fast. Not aggressive. Just present. Leave him alone, John said. The bully scoffed. Or what? John didn't raise his fists. He didn't change his tone. Or you'll have to deal with me. That was enough. The bully hesitated, eyes flicking to John's stance. His calm. The stories already floating through the halls. He backed off with a muttered insult. Marcus stared at John. Thanks, he whispered. John nodded. That was it. Word spread again. but this time differently. John wasn't just the kid who beat Rick. He was the kid who stopped fights before they started. Rick approached him after school a few days later. Awkward. Unsure. You, Rick said, scratching the back of his neck. Where'd you learn that stuff? John thought for a moment. A movie, he said. Rick blinked. You serious? John nodded. Rick let out a short laugh. Guess I should watch better movies. They stood there in silence. Not hostile. Not friendly. Just honest. You wanna show me sometime? Rick asked quietly. John studied him. The old Rick would have demanded. This one asked. Yeah, John said. After school. Basement. Training together felt strange at first. Rick struggled with basics John now took for granted. He got frustrated. He lost balance. He breathed wrong. John corrected him patiently. Slow down. Breathe. Again. Rick listened. Something shifted between them. Not friendship yet. Understanding. Weeks passed. John's reputation settled into something steady. No myths. No exaggerations. Just respect. He didn't look for fights. He didn't need to. One evening, John sat alone watching the movie again. Same scenes. Same music. But everything felt different now. He smiled, not because the hero won, but because he understood the journey. Strength wasn't loud. It wasn't cruel. It wasn't about proving someone wrong. It was about choosing who you became when no one was watching. John turned off the TV and sat in the quiet basement, breathing evenly. The silence no longer echoed with pain or doubt. Felt earned. The legend didn't arrive all at once. It built itself quietly the way real things do. John didn't wake up one day to applause or attention. What changed was subtler. Doors opened a little wider when he walked through the halls. Voices softened when his name came up. People didn't move out of fear, they moved out of awareness. He noticed it first in the small moments. A chair pulled out for him in the library without a word. A nod from a senior he'd never spoken to. A teacher asking for his opinion and actually waiting for the answer. None of it felt dramatic, but all of it felt new. John stayed the same. Or at least he tried to. He still sat in the same seat. Still walked home the same way. Still trained in the basement when the house went quiet. But inside him, something had settled into place. Confidence, not loud, not demanding, steady. Rick changed too. More than people expected. He still laughed, still joked, but the edge was gone. He stopped pushing people around. When his friends started in on someone weaker, Rick shut it down with a look. Not worth it, he'd say. Those words traveled. After-school training became routine. Rick showed up awkward at first, hands in his pockets, unsure whether he belonged there. John didn't treat him like a project or a punishment. He treated him like a student. Again, John said calmly when Rick threw a sloppy punch. Rick groaned. Man, how do you make this look easy? It's not easy, John replied. It's practiced. Rick wiped sweat from his forehead. Guess I never practiced anything but being a jerk. John didn't argue. He just handed him the broomstick. Other kids started asking questions. Not about fighting but about discipline, focus, confidence. John answered when it mattered and stayed quiet when it didn't. One afternoon, Marcus, the kid John had defended, sat beside him at lunch. People say you're dangerous, Marcus said nervously. John raised an eyebrow. Do I look dangerous? Marcus shrugged. You look calm. John smiled faintly. That's better. The biggest test came quietly. No punches. No threats. Just choice. A substitute teacher lost control of the class one day. Noise exploded. Paper flew. Someone shoved another kid hard enough to knock him into a desk. Everyone waited. Not for Rick. For John. John stood up slowly. Enough. That was it. The room stilled. The substitute stared. Stunned. Students returned to their seats without complaint. Not because John demanded it, but because they trusted him. Later that night, John sat alone in the basement, laptop open. The movie paused on the final scene. He didn't press play immediately. He thought about the first time he'd watched it. How desperate he'd been. How empty. He thought about the punch, the laughter, the words that had tried to define him. You'll never be anything but a punching bag. John exhaled slowly. He played the final scene. The hero stood victorious, bruised but unbroken. The music swelled. The crowd cheered. John smiled. Not because he felt like the hero, but because he understood something deeper now. The movie hadn't made him strong. The decision had. He closed the laptop and sat in the quiet, listening to his own breathing. Calm. Even. Controlled. Tomorrow someone else might need help. Tomorrow he'd show up, not with fists, but with presence. Because real strength wasn't about winning fights. It was about ending them. John stood, turned off the basement light, and climbed the stairs. The house was silent, peaceful, and for the first time in a long time so was he. Subscribe if this story stayed with you. Don't let it end here. Subscribe now because one choice can change everything, and the next story might change you.